You know that meme, emotional baggage? Well, it always makes me chuckle a little bit because as somebody that practices in the field, it's kind of true. And that's inadvertently what this video is about today. It's about how the role of trauma and ongoing trauma can actually affect the development of future clinical disorders. And so I'll introduce myself briefly. I'm Kim Long. I'm with Docha Psychological Services in Spruce Grove, Alberta. As always, this is educational content. It's my views. I'm not doing a deep dive into the research on this one because otherwise it would be way too psychobabbly and defeats the purpose of actually sharing meaningful information. Sometimes we get lost in the academia of it all. So I want to talk just briefly about what trauma is. Trauma is when, in my opinion, is when your system is overwhelmed to the point that you're helpless in that situation. You can't, your regular coping strategies don't work. And that can have significant impacts on how you view yourself, the world, other people. It can have lasting impacts in your ability to emotionally regulate, and it can have lasting impacts on your physical self, resulting in things like autoimmune disorders even. There's some research to support that. So I'm not gonna kind of keep going down that road because otherwise we're gonna veer too far away. But when you think about trauma in that lens of your system was overwhelmed and your regular coping strategies don't work, you can then think that because we are naturally hardwired to survive, we come up with some pretty interesting ways to overcome that trauma. These ways aren't always considered healthy. So if you think about it, sometimes if people start to drink or use drugs, that can be a form of coping. Self-harm can be a form of coping. Withdrawal from the world and from others and relationships, the way we see in depression, can be a form of coping. So depending on how well resourced you are at the time that the trauma occurs and how how resilient you are at that time, it can really affect the development of these clinical diagnoses later on. So sorry, too many thoughts going on in my head around this because this is a pretty big topic to try to bring down. So when you think about complex trauma, let's go back to childhood. When you think about little ones that are exposed to traumatic environments, they're definitely vulnerable and helpless. They haven't yet been exposed to challenging situations on a more minor scale where they can learn resiliency and they can learn, hey, I can overcome this and I have the skills to do that. They're kind of pushed into the deep end of trauma and horribleness, if that's even a word. And so in order for them to cope, they have to almost twist their thinking so that they don't blame their caregiver, because if they do, they're losing probably the only resource they have. And you can imagine how that could have some long-term effects on how they view themselves, the world, their safety within it, their place in it, who they are, all of those things. So some studies have shown that, for example, personality disorders like narcissism and borderline personality disorder develop as a result of exposure to really, really traumatic things as a child. And it's, in a way, these become some not so healthy coping strategies or survival strategies for that child. And the thing is that as a child, those strategies may work for them, and that's why they keep using them. But as an adult or as a teenager, it's not so helpful, but they haven't learned any other ways. So in order to protect themselves and their psyche, they keep getting stuck in this pattern. Now, personality disorders, not my field of expertise. They fascinate me, but it isn't something that I work a lot with. So I will defer to the judgment of those that are better versed in it. But that's my basic rudimentary understanding of it, is that in a way it is a survival skill, even though we see it as being super destructive. Then if you think about something like, on an extreme end, dissociative identity disorder, that's where the person completely checks out. They have what's called alters, where there are different parts of the self that function at different times to keep the core, more vulnerable self protected, but they're unaware of each other because they dissociate. We all dissociate to a certain extent, just like we all exhibit signs of narcissism and borderline personality disorder in certain facets of our lives, depending on what's going on in the context. But dissociation shows up in a lot of other mental disorders as well, simply because what happens when our system is overwhelmed is sometimes it takes us out of it. So we don't feel like we're there anymore. We feel like we're in a dream. That's dissociation. And that shows up in PTSD. Just like in PTSD and some of the other trauma and stressor-related disorders, anxiety and depression can be there. And so again, if you think about it as this is a way that somebody's trying to cope, with PTSD, you see hypervigilance. They're always checking, making sure that everything is a threat. So they're always on guard for that threat. As a result, they end up really exhausted. Their view of the world is that it's unsafe. Their view of themselves is that they can't be trusted, or that they couldn't handle it, and they beat themselves up for that. So there's a lot of shame. All of that kind of relates to depression. So you can see how depression can be a way of us figuring out, listen, if I just beat myself up, then I will monitor my own behavior so that I'm not ever under threat again. If I just stay quiet and small, and also if I'm exhausted, right? It's another way of coping that maybe we don't understand, or it's a way of indicating that the system is overwhelmed. Same with anxiety, same with anger, same with all of those things. It's a way of coping with trauma. Some in the field that I've talked with also say that there's a lot of overlap with ADHD. Not to say that everyone with ADHD has experienced trauma, but if you think about it, that ADHD is a problem, well, it's not really a problem of executive function. It's a problem of there's no filter on the stimuli coming in, because everything's coming in. Your system is constantly overwhelmed. So some of the ways that some of the behaviors that you see there can mimic trauma. So I don't know if I've actually answered the question about what's the role of trauma in the development of all of these other disorders. I think at the end of the day, if I really simplified it, in my opinion, it comes down to trauma affects the development of other clinical mental disorders, in that it can create some not as healthy ways of coping and surviving in our world. And those will show up in many different ways for many different people. And the way that it shows up for those people and how pervasive it is in their life and how much it shuts them down and creates issues for them, that's what can lead to the label of some sort of mental health disorder. So that was a really long-winded video just to get to that point, but thanks for sticking with me. So as always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Like I said, it's a pretty big issue to try to get into a video that's less than 10 minutes. But hopefully it helps destigmatize some of it for some of you, and helps you maybe think about, what am I using this to cope with? Like, you're not broken, you're just trying to survive. So, at the same time, you don't get to be a jerk. Like, it doesn't give you free rein. And what is also true is maybe reframe it. And it might lead you somewhere that brings you to some strategies that maybe aren't so destructive for you and actually help you a bit more. So in the meantime, please take care of yourself, and we'll see you later. Bye for now.